So it's 10 o'clock and it's time for us to start our webinar here today, where we'll be focusing on postdoctoral funding from Horizon Europe for individual grants. Welcome all. And my name is Anne Meiboom, and I'm one of the Marie Skłodowska-Curie national contact points here in Denmark. And with me, I have my name colleague, Anne Overgaard Jørgensen, who is one of the European Research Council national contact points here in Denmark. We're very happy to be doing this webinar today. It's sort of a first for us to have a look at the postdoctoral funding available in these two programs. And we're happy that more than 200 people have registered for the webinar. Yeah, so we'll see if it's a success, and we'll have to do it again. A few practicalities. So the webinar is recorded today. We'll send out a link to the recording after the session, and we'll also send the presentation with the slide from today. As for questions, you're more than welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please do so by using the Q&A function. We'll have some breaks and we'll take up the questions there. And then if there's any other issues, technical or other, you can write it in the chat. So questions in the Q&A. And then just a look at the agenda for today. So a short welcome from us in just about a minute, where we'll focus on our role as national contact points, and then also sort of setting the scene of Horizon Europe in general. Then I'll dive into the postdoctoral fellowships under Marie Curie, sort of the eligibility rules and the funding available, and also the format of the application. And then we have some time for Q&A, as I said, and then Anne here will dive into the starting and consolidated grants under ERC, and then more time for questions. And then we are delighted to have Enrico Capellini with us today. Enrico is fortunate enough to have received funding from both programs, and we're excited to hear his experiences with the two programs. And then hopefully we also have some time for questions at the very end. So today we're focusing on Marie Skłodowska-Curie and the European Research Council and the sort of postdoctoral funding that is available through individual grants here. And we are doing so because we really want to highlight the opportunities that exist in both of these programs. As a researcher, you may have your eyes set on funding from ERC, but to this, it's important for us to also highlight that the funding available in Marie Curie for postdoc funding may be more appropriate for you as a researcher in certain points of your career. Also to highlight that funding from both of these programs are sort of prestigious awards that are very beneficial for the researcher career. And that's, one of the things we want to highlight. And then also to show a little bit about a possible career path from or through these two programs, because we do actually see an increased success rates for applicants to ERC who already have a Marie Curie fellowship. So we'll get back to that as well. And then I'll pass the floor to you, Anne.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Well, I want to say a bit about the place Anne and I are working. We work at the Danish Agency for Higher Education and Science, and we are based here in Copenhagen. And our office is named the Eurocenter. And we both work as national contact point, as Anne just mentioned, NCPs. And our task is to provide information about Horizon Europe, give counseling and information about opportunities in Horizon Europe, tell you about the requirements and rules if you want to apply for funding from Horizon Europe. And we do so for free, and you're always welcome to contact us by phone or email. Moreover, we are also program committee members. This means that we're representing Denmark in program committees under Horizon Europe, where we have dialogues with mostly the European Commission, but also other member states, where we discuss and note about the structure and content of future work programs for the different programs in Horizon Europe. Our services include a lot of different things. We do counseling via email and phone. If you want to know which part of Horizon Europe you should apply for, we can also help you if you are in the process of writing an application or proposal. If you have a more complicated issue, we can have a client meeting and meet face to face and discuss what you want to do. We also give webinars like this one today. We have a lot of other webinars that are recorded. You can find on our webpage, and we organize information meetings and give presentation on information meetings. We do a lot of network meetings, and we also teach courses on Horizon Europe. We have a magazine named EU Indblik in Danish, which we publish twice a year on paper on different aspects of Horizon Europe. And we also have a lot of social media activities on Twitter and LinkedIn, where we give sort of spread information from the European Commission and other stakeholders, which is relevant for you if you work as a researcher, etc. I want to give a brief overview of Horizon Europe. It's a really large program. It lasts for 7 years, and it consists of 3 pillars. And today we're only going to focus on pillar 1, which is the excellence science pillar. And as you can see, we have the European Research Council, which is sort of close to Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, and they have a lot of similarities, as we want to demonstrate in details at this webinar. Now I have a short sort of a description of how to understand Horizon Europe. It's the 9th framework program from EU with the targets to fund research and innovation for European citizens and researchers and companies, etc. It has a quite large budget, 84.9 billion euros in total for the 7 years is sort of to be handed out to researchers in Europe. And the aim is to fund the very best research, innovation, and social transitions in Europe. ERC has a quite large chunk of the budget. It has 16 billion euros, whereas Marie Skłodowska-Curie has also a slightly large budget. It has 6.6 billion euros for these 7 years to hand out. Yep.
So this being sort of the introduction, we'll move on to the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions postdoctoral fellowships. And so the fellowships are for experienced researchers who want to strengthen their careers by working abroad for a period of time. It's also an opportunity for organizations and research group leaders to attract very qualified researchers to their research groups. So postdoctoral fellowships, there's an annual call, and for the call this year in 2023, it was announced 12th of April. There's a deadline 13th of September, and this year's call has a budget of just over 260 million euro. About the postdoctoral fellowships, the aim is to strengthen researchers who already have a doctoral degree. It's a bottom-up program, which means that you bring your research of choice to the table, and a fellow will here work on an individual research project and have a supervisor assigned throughout the period. Focus is on I3 mobility as part of the project, so it's international, intersectoral, and interdisciplinary mobility. So physical mobility is a key part of the individual or of the postdoctoral fellowships, something that differs a little bit from ERC, which Anna will go into later. Then there's also focus on the involvement of non-academic sector organizations. So this is something that's also encouraged and highlighted in the postdoctoral fellowships to involve non-academic partners and to have sort of a strong connection to industry and non-academic areas. The program funds all research domains. This is including research areas covered by the Euratom Treaty. This is actually a new thing in Horizon that in Horizon Europe, that Euratom areas are covered. There are two types of fellowships. So first we have the European fellowships. These are open to researchers of any nationality who are wanting to come to Europe to do research, or to move from one European country or what we call associated countries to another. So associated countries are countries who have chosen to associate to Horizon Europe through a formal agreement. Then we have the global fellowships. Here there is, or these are open to European nationals or those who are long-term residents in Europe or an associated country. And this is meaning a period of more than 5 consecutive years. Then you are eligible to apply for a global fellowship. Here you have mobility to a third country. And this will be followed by a mandatory period where you're back at an organization in an EU member state or one of these associated countries. And if we look at the duration, so the European fellowships are 12 to 24 months. The global fellowships a little bit longer because you have this outgoing period as well as the return phase. So these being between 24 and 36 months. 12 to 24 months are spent in the third country, and then you have 12 months in back in an organization in a member state or associated country. It's possible to add for both of them 6 months in a non-academic organization. This is known as placement, and is also a new thing in Horizon Europe, again to encourage the connection to non-academic organizations. This is added at the end of the project period. Secondments are encouraged where it makes sense in the fellowships, and up to 1/3 of the duration can be used for these secondments that can take place in any type of organization. As for eligibility, so it's a fellowship for experienced researchers. This means that you have to be in possession of a doctoral degree. This is defined as you have to have successfully defended your thesis. You do not have to have the diploma in hand necessarily, but you do have to have successfully defended the thesis. Then there's a limit on research experience, and this is set at 8 years full-time equivalent research experience after the doctoral degree. So this will be the date that's on your diploma. This is when the 8 years experience will start to count. There are some incentives for career restart and for reintegration. This means that time that you've been away from research, for instance, on maternity or paternity leave, if there's been sort of a long-term sick leave, this will not be factored into your years of experience. And for reintegration, it means that if you've worked with research in a third country and you're wanting to reintegrate to Europe, the time spent working with research in a third country will not be counted towards your full-time experience. Then the single mobility rule is important for the postdoctoral fellowships. The rule is that as an applicant, you must not have resided or carried out your main activity in the country of the beneficiary for more than 12 months in the 36 months immediately before the call deadline. So if you're based in a country and you're wanting to apply for a fellowship with an organization in this country, you have to make sure that you've not been with that organization in that country for more than 12 months in the last 3 years. So this is a sort of a hard rule, so you really have to count the days in some instances. Then the Commission has introduced sort of a restriction on resubmission in an attempt to assure that success rates are not unnecessarily low because of very low scoring applications coming in. So the rule is that if you've applied and you've received a score that's of less than 70%, then you're not allowed to reapply the following year. You can apply the year after that, but it's really an encouragement to spend some time to look at the application and make sure it's strong enough to receive a score where you'll be considered for funding. And if we look at the funding available in the postdoctoral fellowships, so first we have the contributions for the researchers, and then we have institutional contributions. The contributions for the researchers, first here you have the living allowance. And for Denmark, or for every country, a country correction coefficient is applied. For Denmark, it's set at 132% because the living expenses are quite high here in Denmark, but you'll have to look into the coefficient for the country you're considering to see sort of the exact amount. The living allowance standards is 5,080 euro, but for Denmark, it will bring it up over 6,000 euros when factoring in the coefficient. And then you have mobility allowance, which is 600 euro per month. This is to cover private travel of the researchers throughout the project. And then if you are eligible for it, there's a family allowance available. You are eligible if you are married or if you have dependent children. This is set at 660 euro per month. If you get married or you have a child sometime in the project, then you will become eligible at that point. Then we also have long-term leave allowance, which means that if there is a parental leave or a sort of a longer-term sick leave, and some of the funds are not covered by the beneficiary or the country that the researcher is based in, then this can be covered by the commission as well. Special needs allowance, sort of the last one of the columns for researcher contributions, is if there is a special need that needs to be met. For instance, if there's a need to purchase a ramp for someone who's using a wheelchair, then this can be covered also through the project. Then we have the institutional unit contributions. There is funding for research training and networking, of course, and this is set at 1,000 euro per person month. And then management and indirect contribution to sort of manage the project in general is set at 650 euro per person month. So what is interesting here about the postdoctoral fellowships is that these unit contributions are used to calculate the full amount of the grant. And then just sort of a brief look at the application form and what that looks like. So you have a part A and a part B. Part A consists of data added electronically in the funding and tenders portal. This will be information about the host organization as well as the researcher applicant. And then you have part B1 and B2. Part B1 covers excellence, impact, and implementation. These are all three key parts of your application. I know for ERC, it's excellence, that's the main focus, but for the postdoctoral fellowships application, all three are very important. There's a maximum of 10 pages for the full application. Then also part B2 covers information about the researchers, so the CV, also about the host organization more in detail, the capacity of the organization. No page limit for B2. And then I also wanted to address the evaluation. The evaluation is evaluated in one of these 8 panels that you see here on the slide, and that results in 2 ranking lists per panel. So one for European fellowships and then one for the global fellowships. I won't go into detail about the process, but just to say that a minimum of 3 experts will evaluate the proposal, and then there is sort of a consensus group meeting where the final score is decided, and the projects will then be listed in sort of main list, reserve list, below available budget, and below threshold. The threshold is set at 70% for postdoctoral fellowship, so below that you will not sort of be considered for funding. The evaluation criteria, as I said, these 3 main parts of the application: excellence, impact, and implementation. These are all sort of looked carefully upon in the evaluation, and I've added the evaluation criteria here because they're very important to have in mind when writing an application and make sure that they are all addressed. And then I said the sort of threshold was set at 70%, but what we do see is that the actual sort of cutoff scores for when you'll become sort of eligible for funding are quite higher. So here are the cutoff scores from the postdoctoral fellowships in Horizon Europe, so the last 3 years since Horizon Europe started. And as you can see, they're all except one, I think, up in the 90s. So a high score is needed to be considered for funding. And then I just have 2 slides to finish off sort of my part. And there's some statistics from the last call from 2022. And if we look at all countries, there were just under 7,000 applications submitted. And out of these, 1,235 were funded. So this comes to an overall success rate for last year's call of 17.88%. So a fairly high success rate for a program of this type. And then if we look at Denmark, which we always like to do, being based here in Denmark, there was submitted 344 applications with a Danish host organization. 83 of these were funded, which comes to also a very high success rate of 24.13, so quite higher than the average for all countries. So yeah, we're just saying that applications with Danish host organizations are often quite strong. And I think that was it for the Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, sort of going through the criteria and such. And I don't know, any of you had any questions coming?
Questions in the chat.
I will. Yeah. Okay, let's see. So a question here from Matthias. You said that MSCA is for researchers who want to do work abroad. However, if you're a Danish postdoctoral researcher already working abroad, can you use the grant to go back to Denmark? I think maybe the question was before I went through so some of the incentives for reintegration. So if you are abroad in a third country, for instance, and you're wanting to come back, then if you fall under the 8-year full-time experience, and yes, you can definitely use it to come back. And then see next here we have Nils. Okay, what do you mean by person months? Does that mean that an MSCA fellow could be 24 to 48 months at 0.5 employment? Yeah, so person month is sort of just the terminology we use in the program because we use these unit contributions, which are 1 person month. So that automatically brings about funding. That's how the funding is calculated. It is possible to work part-time, but not initially. So you apply where you'll be working full-time, but if there are reasons that sort of account for a need for part-time, then it's possible to have that implemented once the project started. So when a project is started, a project officer will be assigned, and this is something you would take up with the project officer. All right, regarding, there's another question also from Niels regarding the resubmission restriction. Your slide made it sound like it's okay to reapply the next year as the same applicant with another host university. Is that correctly understood? And yes, that is correctly understood. If you as a researcher reply with another host organization, then it's not considered a resubmission. Then it is considered that your application will be so different that it's not a resubmission. So this is possible. Yes. And then there's an anonymous question that says, does the CV have a page limit anymore? And no, there's no page limit to the CV as part of part B2. And then there's a question from Mithodi. Can you say something about identifying the right panel? What about cross-panel submissions? So when you apply, you will have to use keywords. And those will determine where your application will be evaluated in which panel. So of course, important to use the correct and most appropriate keywords here. And also a question about what about cross-panel submissions? So if you add the keywords that indicate that there might be sort of interdisciplinarity, that other research areas have to come into play, then this will also be considered if it's sort of clarified through the keywords. All right, I will take, I think, a couple more questions, and then I think we have to also move on. But we'll have, I think, more time at the end as well, where we can dive into more of them. There's a question from Arlen. Is the UK an associated country? For example, if we want to do a case study there. So the UK is not considered an associated country at this point. So the association agreement is still ongoing, but you will apply as if the UK is associated. So in that sense, yes, it can be considered, but it's still not, the negotiations are not finalized. And again, a question also about from Isabel on how to decide between panels. And I would say again, the sort of keywords that define the research area, of course, what should bring you to the correct panel. All right, I think for now I'll just leave some of the questions here and move on to you so we don't lose track of time, but we'll get back to the questions.
Thank you so much. Now I will turn to the European Research Council, ERC, for my presentation on that. First of all, I want to say a bit about what ERC is offering. ERC is offering scientific freedom for the researcher applying for ERC grant. The only evaluation criteria is excellence, so you just have to be among the very best in your field to get an ERC grant. They will not assess you how you sort of will carry out the implementation of your project. ERC offers support to the individual scientists. They don't support large consortia as we see in other parts of Horizon Europe, especially Pillar 2. ERC offers support for bottom-up projects. There's no predetermined subjects. You come with your very own idea and get funding for that. And then ERC offers support to frontier and excellent research in all fields of science. ERC gives you peer-reviewed assessment, and it's made by the very top researchers in your field and neighboring fields, both at the panel, but also external remote referees are called in to give you the very best evaluation possible. ERC is completely free of politics. It's managed by a scientific council, which is independent, which consists of 22 members, which are top scientists from all over Europe, and they have also a ERC president, which gives them kind of a lot of autonomy about the funding strategy and how the work programs are written. ERC also has its own agency, which gives them a very dedicated support mechanism in Brussels. As a researcher, ERC offers you independence, recognition, and visibility. It gives you the chance to work on the research project of your very own choice. With a team, you can hire yourself, so it will also be a team of your own choice. It gains, you can gain funding for quite a lot of years, for 5 years, which is a quite long postdoc grant to get It also often gives you a chance to negotiate the very best condition of work with your host institution, because the ESC grants are quite prestigious. So your host institution would quite often like to hold on to you and give you a bit sort of perhaps extra support in different ways, depending on which field of research you're doing your project in. And we often see that once you have an ESC grant, it's a chance to attract the very best team members from both Europe and EU countries and non-EU countries. Another interesting thing about ESC grants is that you can move them to any place in Europe you want to, if necessary. ESC grants are portable, so you can change the institution if it does make sense for you throughout the project. We often also see that once you have an ESC grant, you will attract additional funding and gain recognition in your field, because ESC is becoming a quality label, which is quite well established in research communities all over Europe. ESC is built up on 4 main grants. We have the starting grants, the consolidated grants, which I will go into depth through in the next slides. If you are a bit more advanced, we have the advanced grant. And then we have the synergy grants, which is fairly new. It was re-established in 2018, where you can go together 2 to 4 PIs to apply for quite a large sum of money. Once you have an ESC grant, you can apply for proof of concept means, which is a lump sum you get to if you want to do not research, but perhaps if you want to apply for a patent or do some demonstration and so on. So it's more of an innovation type of grant. Starting grants you can apply for once you have a PhD that is 2 to 7 years old, and you can apply for up to 1.5 million euros for up to 5 years. You can also apply for less, obviously. And consolidated grant you can apply for when you are a bit more advanced in your career as a researcher. You need to have a PhD that is between 7 to 12 years old. And here the amount is a bit larger. You can apply for up to 2 million euros, again, up to 5 years. Then I want to say a bit more about the starting grants. The objective is to support excellent PIs in the stage where they're still sort of starting their own independent research team or independent research program. And the grant size is 1.5 million euros for up to 5 years, as I just mentioned. And you can also, there's also a possibility to apply for additional 1.1 million euros if you need some special equipment of your, or if you're doing a really sort of large scale field work, for instance. But it's quite difficult to get the additional 1 million euros. So you have to be quite strong. Has to be some quite strong scientific arguments in order to get that. The profile of the starting grants PI is to, you have to have at least 1 publication where you're main author or without your PhD supervisor. You have to show that you have a potential for research independence. And you also need to sort of show on you that you have been invited for presentations in conferences, and that you have achieved funding and patents, perhaps, if that makes sense. It depends on your field, of course. And also, if you have awards or prizes, is also assets to have in your CV. You have to allocate 50% of your time as a principal investigator for this project. And 50% of your working time needs to be in an EU country or associated country. If you're applying for a consolidated grant, your PhD should be between 7 to 12 years. And again, the objective is to support excellent PIs at the stage at which they may still be consolidating their own independent research team or program. So they demand a bit more from you compared to the starting grants. The grant size is also slightly bigger, it's 2 million euros. And here again, you can apply for the additional 1 million euros if you have a need for that. It depends on your field, and it should be large scale equipment or access to large scale equipment or large sort of scale fieldwork you need for that funding. The profile is, of course, slightly different than the starting grant profile. As a consolidated grantee, you need to have achieved a certain degree of research independence. You need to have several publications where you are main author or without your PhD supervisor. You also need to demonstrate that you have been invited to give several presentations and conferences, and also that you have attracted funding and patents, perhaps, or that you have received awards and prizes, and also that you have done a bit of mentoring. And again, it depends on which field you are in and which type of institutions you are in and which country, because in some countries it's difficult to be a supervisor when you're only a postdoc, but it depends. But some sort of mentoring is important in this type of grant. You must allocate 40% of your time to this project, and you should again be half of your time in an EU country or associated country. There are some ways you can extend this eligibility window if you have some reasons for that. You need to document, but if you have a case that you have children, then you can deduct 8 months per child, and it just goes for all children you have had, both before or during or after your PhD degree. And if you're a father, you can take the actual time you took off while you have parental leave. If you have had a long time illness, it should be more than 90 days. Then you can also deduct that. And also if you have been doing some national service in the army, for instance. If you're a medical doctor or dentist or the like, you can also deduct clinical training. And also if you've been caring for a seriously ill family member, it should be child or spouse or sort of a quite close family member, of course, you can also deduct that. And as a new thing, you can also deduct time that has prevented you from working if you have been a victim of a natural disaster, or also if you have spent time seeking asylum in another country and so on. And those are new things. And there's no limit to the total extension you can get as a researcher applying for starting a consolidated grant. So this is quite important to keep in mind if you want to apply for one of those grants. It's obviously important that you can document all those things before you get this extension, but this is something we quite often see. Then I want to move on and say a bit about the proposal structure for the application. In total, there are 4 parts of the application, and it's quite similar to the Marie Skłodowska-Curie application in some ways. We have a part A, and also here is an online form. You have to give some proposal info. You have to give some info about your host institution and your PI yourself. You have to make a budget. You have to, if relevant, you have to write a bit about the ethical issues of your project. And then can also be some course-specific info you have to give them. Then we have a part B, which is extended synopsis. It's fairly short, but it's all the science you have to propose here. It's to be 5 pages, and then there's a CV and early achievement record. Then we have the part 2, which is sort of the heavy part of the application. It's 14 pages where you have to go into this and give a lot of scientific outline of the project you proposed ERC to do. You'll need to give state of the art in your field and objectives, and also, of course, in which way you are breaking the state of the art in the project you propose. And then you have to dive into methodology and resources of your project. And then you have the annexes, and they're quite important here at ERC. We have a mandatory host institution support letter, which your host institution has to sign and say that they want to support you and host you for this duration of the project. Then you have to have a copy of your PhD degree. And also, if you want to extend the eligibility window, you have to document that quite extensively. Then you have to choose a panel to send the application for, and Marie Skłodowska-Curie has 8 panels. In ERC, there are 27 panels, and they are grouped in 3 scientific domains. We have a life science domain, and we have a physical sciences and engineering domain, and we have a social sciences and humanities domain. And you can see the outline of the panels here. And in the next work program, which will be published in the middle of July, there will be an extra panel for social sciences and humanity as well. So there will be a total of 28 panels from now on. Then I want to say a bit about the evaluation process. As mentioned beforehand, excellence is the sole evaluation criteria at ERC. Both the excellence of the research project, it has to be groundbreaking, it has to be able to create a potential and impact in your field, but also in neighboring fields. ERC is only looking for scientific impact, so you don't really have to write in much about societal impact. And then also they want to know about the excellence of the scientific approach you plan to take in this project. Then also the excellence of the principal investigator, the PI, is assessed, and you have to show as a PI that you are intellectual and you are also capable of carrying out an ERC project, and that you're creative, and also that you're committed to the project, because it is a quite demanding project that they will demand a lot of your time. Then I want to give an overview of the evaluation process for those two types of ERC grants, starting grant and consolidated grants. All of the application, both part B and B1 and B2 and all the annexes and so on, will be submitted at once. And we have one deadline per year for those grants. And then we have a step 1 where panel members will evaluate only part B of your application. And panel members are recruited by invitation only. You cannot yourself suggest to be an ERC evaluator. Is quite prestigious. So ERC's agency will ask top researchers from all over the world, mainly Europe, of course, but we'll ask them to be panel members. And then the panel members will read your application at the first panel meeting. They will have a quite generalist approach, but still, I mean, you have to take into account that they are top sciences. So you have to balance what you're writing, because it should be accessible, but also you're catering for people who are sort of top researchers in their fields. If you get a B or C score, you will have to wait 1 or 2 years before you can apply. If you're lucky enough to retain an A score, you will move on to step 2. And then the full application, both part B1 and part B2, will be read by the panel members, but also the remote referees, which are experts in your field, quite narrowly in your field, that will be reading the proposal, the full scientific proposal, and give scores. Then there will be a second panel meeting, and there will be an interview for starting and consolidated applicants. Before COVID, it used to be an on-site interview in Brussels. But now, since COVID, and it will also continue this way, we see an online interview, and ERC will like to keep this online interview, because they want to sort of limit flying and so on. The interview is fairly short. It depends a bit on the panel, but it's between 20 minutes to half an hour. And if you're lucky enough to get an A score, you will be recommended for funding, and hopefully you will be one of the lucky enough to get the funding. It's not all A scores that ERC can fund, because they have a limited budget. Yeah, time is running, and I will just move on to my 2 last slides, which is a bit of statistics, just that as my colleague Anne also had in her presentation. I will say a bit about success rates from the former framework program, Horizon 2020. And you can see that the blue line is the Danish success rate, and the red is the overall success rate from ERC. And in some calls, some years Denmark are doing fairly well, but we also see some slopes where Denmark is not doing so well compared to the quite high amount of applications we are submitted. And my very last slide is an overview of the number of applications submitted from 14 to 21, and also what number of grants we have received here in Danish institutions. And again, you can see some years we are really submitting quite a high number of applications and not receiving that many. Yeah, it's nice that Denmark are quite active in ERC, but we also sometimes have a potential to submit stronger applications. Yeah, and I will see if there's any questions for me.
There are some questions, yes.
Okay.
So you can, if you look at the Q&A, then the first, I think, is from Niels.
Yeah.
Christian Hansen.
Oh, you can see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I have a question. I'm not sure I can. Yeah. Nils is asking, invited presentations and conference, does this include regular conference presentation where I submit an abstract that gets accepted, or does this term primarily refer to keynote talks? That's a very good question. I would say both. I mean, it's included, but it does, especially when you're starting grant, include that regular conferences where you submit an abstract and is invited to give a speech. When you move on in your career, you will hopefully be giving more keynote speaks, so that can also be included. But as a starting grant, it's fine that you just include regular conference presentations. But if you have already as a starting grant been keynote, then of course you should underline that in your CV. Then I have one from Barbara. She's asking about the starting grant. What is meant by 50% of PI's time in the project and 50% in the EU or associated country? I mean, what work, if not in the project, is involved in the 50% in the EU or associated country? Teaching or participating in other projects, or well, it's just work on the ERC project that included here to look on in this calculation. And then Manke is asking, could you please specify what is meant by papers as main author or without your PhD supervisor? In my field, it is almost unheard of to publish without a supervisor, head of the lab. I have papers where I'm joint a senior author with my supervisor. Does this count? And yeah, it is. This is what I said was a sort of the generic term, but the ERC and ERC panel members are totally aware that this differs from field to field. And if you apply for ERC starting grant or consolidated grant, the panel you will send your application for, they will know that in your field is unheard of, for instance, to publish without your head of a lab. Yeah. So this is what should be fine, but it's just very important that you sort of show that you have taken responsibility in the publication and that you have done some independent work as a researcher. And then Elizabeth is asking, well, it's a bit of the same about the conference. I would skip that one. And then Ebbe is asking, what is the start date of Time Since PhD? And the start date is the date you have been defending your PhD. Very Klokke.
It's 10:02, so may take one more question and we'll move on to.
Yeah, I'll take one more question and then yeah. And then there's an anonymous who is asking can the corona pandemic be considered a national disaster? I had a break at my research career due to it. I had a 6 months period without salary and an amendment of my research contract. And that's a very good question. I'm sorry to say that they cannot, that they don't really consider the corona pandemic as a national disaster in this sense. So you can, of course, in your CV, I would recommend that you in your CV write a bit about this sort of break in your CV, but you cannot deduct a career break due to COVID. I'm sorry to say that.
Right, we move on. And then if you can, Anna, you can answer some of the questions over in writing in the chat. I did so a little bit as well when I was waiting. So I'm sorry if you heard the tapping of my keyboard. Just one more slide from me, and then I'll pass the floor to you, Enrico. So this just to come back to, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we do see increased success rates for those who already have an MSCA or are an MSCA fellow and then apply for an ERC grant. So what this means that if you have an MSCA grant of some type, then a statistic shows that there's you're 20% more likely to have your ERC grant application be successful. So for Horizon 2020, which is where we have numbers from, this meant that if you have an MSCA grant of some type and you then apply for an ERC grant of some type, then your success rate or the success rate is set at 14.36% versus the ERC average back in Horizon 2020, which was at 11.93%. If you then are a researcher who holds an MSCA individual fellowship, which is the old name for the postdoctoral fellowship, then you have a 38% higher success rate when you go on to apply for an ERC grant. So this is specifically for the postdoctoral fellowship. If you have one of these and then apply for ERC. Here, the success rate for Horizon 2020 was then set at 16.47% versus the ERC average of 11.93%. So this is just to sort of showcase that there is increased success rates for MSCA fellows when they go on to apply for an ERC grant. With that, I'll pass the floor to you, Enrico. I'm sorry that we're already running a little bit late of time, but I hope everyone will stay with us, and we'll also be here for questions later if people have time. So Enrico, passing the floor to you. You are associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, have been very successful with MSCA and also with ERC. And maybe you want to clarify what that means, so I don't go through your resume, but please share with us the funding you've received.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Hannah and Hannah, for hosting me here today. I would like to simply describe my experience and some of the aspects that characterize my career in connection with the two programs we are describing here today, and in particular, I would like to describe the aspects associated with the specific characteristics of the two programs. My experience in preparing both applications, the circumstances when it happened, and how I managed how this helped me a lot in my career. So I'm based at the University of Copenhagen, as mentioned in the slide, and specifically I work at the Globe Institute. And my research line is focused on analysis of ancient biomolecules that can be retrieved from fossils, ancient plants, sediments, and at the moment I'm focused on reconstruction of human evolution. I would point out what I think it's one of the main differences between the two programs. So while the ERC is an excellence program, the Marie Curie program is still associated with training, an advanced training aspect, and strongly associated with mobility. This means that at least it gave me the possibility to, when I was at the end of my PhD in 2003, to have the opportunity to think about the possibility to how to continue my research after my PhD, moving within Europe in in the research environment that I thought it was the most interesting for me to continue to do the research activity I liked most, and again to do it with some among the best people. So this is what I saw as a great opportunity. So acquired that experience associated with internationalization, because at the time, the first time it was applied in 2003, started in 2004 to move from Italy, where I was doing my PhD, to the United Kingdom, to the University of York. And accordingly start to have, if for those who don't have it yet, the experience of internationalization, start to be embedded in a larger group and have the possibility to do the research activity I liked most. And at the time it was ancient DNA, because ancient proteins, that is the line that I developed now, was not there yet. So in my experience, I started contacting the group I wanted to join in at the end of 22, so about 6 months before the deadline. I went there and we had a quick meeting, and we said, okay, let's go for a joint application. And the training, as the research-based training aspect, is crucial in the application, because when you will see it when you download the template. What you see is that what the questions and the point that need to be covered ask are what is the contribution that you bring to the institution that is going to host you? What is of course, what are you going to learn in the new institution you're going to join, a new research environment you're going to join, and how these affect your future career potential? So how this will benefit for you to have a successful career. And in case you include a secondment period, let's say this kind of exchange should interest the three institutions. So what are you bringing both to the host institution and to the secondment institution, and what the two of them are receiving from you and from the interaction with each other through you. So all these aspects are very crucial. This doesn't exist at ERC level. At ERC level, you're supposed to be you're supposed to have already demonstrated that you deliver good quality research, that you have a visionary idea, and that you're asking for funding to go beyond the state of the art with something potentially transformative. I had the possibility to do so the 2 years in the UK with Marie Curie extended into 5 years with 3 years postdoc after that, and at the end I applied to join well, basically the research group where I'm part of right now, because I wanted to continue working on ancient biomolecules and move from DNA to ancient proteins. And again, also in that case, the aspect of the contribution that I was going to bring, how the match was ideal in terms of enrichment, both from the host institution and from my point of view, and the possibility to continue to develop potentially interesting research, but and potentially high impact, but at the same time not necessarily transformative. So with a level of risk that is lower, also because the amount of what's achievable in a two-year funding program is quite different from what can be achieved in a 5-year funding program. The application was successful. I moved to the UK, and things developed. To move to Denmark, and things move on fast. There was a period of postdoc for me also after that, and I started to apply for funds. Not so successful at the beginning, but then things started to work, and in particular with a certain number of applications, Marie Curie, in this case, to attract fellow colleagues. And during the years, I was the host scientist for 4 of these fellows, and with applications in the other part of the Marie Curie program, that is the one for doctoral networks. And in particular, I coordinated one that concluded, Tempera, that was supporting PhD fellows, and that was Ancient Protein for Cultural Heritage. And now I'm still involved as coordinator for PUSH, that is larger, 14 PhD positions, 3 under my supervision or co-supervision, and it is still ongoing. And I have to say, and I was something that is important, I'd like to mention that I was exchanging experience with colleagues, actually with the person that was my host scientist when I moved from the United Kingdom to Denmark. And he was telling me, Enrico, actually, people like you who came with Marie Curie are those that in the end remained, were retained. And the reason is because basically you take quite a big risk in joining a Marie Curie, because you decide to move, you have to proactively come up with your research project. Of course, the host institution should support you with some aspects associated with the features of the host institution that you cannot know in terms of grant writing preparation, but it's your idea, it's your initiative, so it's a sign of motivation. And this person was saying, after all these years, you and some of the others who arrived here as Marie Curies, you're still around, because already at the time there was a clear sign of motivation. So you don't contact a PI and say, do you have a job for me? But actually it's the opposite. You say, there's this opportunity, you invest personally, you are in a way the grant holder. Of course, you're not the PI because you still need the experience to be integrated in a group, but you start to have the first aspects of independence and the first elements of project management, so of being responsible of delivering the project, your research. You are hosted, you are embedded, but at the same time you start to have the first elements of independence. Completely different is the experience for ERC, because ERC, as it was mentioned before, the only element and criteria is excellence. So you should have already demonstrated to be an emerging scientist, at least in starting and advanced phases. An emerging scientist in your field, someone that already distinguished themselves for specific with specific achievements. Usually can be good papers, but it doesn't have to be necessarily that. There's no aspect associated with mobility. There's no you have the advantage of the portability of your grant. So it's a strong trust that you receive, and you receive a significant amount of resources to further develop your idea. And you should have showed already independence and some traits of leadership or leading research or delivering projects, which is most of the time papers of a certain level of articulation. All these elements, so in this case, the preparation, at least for me, I have to say, I have an advanced grant. Let's say in the first part of my career, I was not at the level of let's say, my research profile was not high to the point to be competitive for an ERC application. And at that point, you start to design your project, which is rich, and you start to choose who you want to attract and who you want to work with. You decide the direction. You are completely responsible of the research project, of the research that you figure out, and you have to show that you do not represent a liability or a risk as a project leader. Also, in this case, the extension of the grant is higher, and accordingly, also the ambition and the plan can be higher. And as a consequence, what they require also is that you take more risk, assuming that your shoulders are already big enough to face that risk, and you can put together a contingency plan in case things go wrong. So in that case, it's much more than just the scientific idea, but how to develop it, how to find the right connection, the authorizations if you need to access a specific material, the equipment, the infrastructure, what you need to purchase in terms of infrastructure. With ERC, you don't buy any infrastructure. You have about 20,000 euros to go to conferences, buy reagents to cover your analytical cost. Here you lead an entire project. I don't want to go longer than this. I already exceeded a bit the scheduled time. If there's any question, I would be happy to answer. Or Anne, if you want me to cover anything else in particular, please just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico. It was very interesting and always good to hear from one of the successful researchers and their sort of concrete experiences. I don't think there's anything that we feel that you need to cover more, but maybe just have a look to see if there's any question coming in. If anyone has any questions for Enrico, you're welcome to type them in the Q&A. Do not think that there has...
Well, if I can add something concerning the preparation of the application, I have to say what happened is that I applied and the first time I got it. But at the same time, I have to say my plan was much less ambitious because my intention was to apply, pass stage A, which means there were no quarantine time, and then reapply in the following year. And this was basically splitting the effort over 2 years in total. I don't know if this is a strategy that is recommended, not recommended, wise or not, but this is how I planned it. And the idea, so I focused a lot or more on writing the first plan, the part B1, so that at least, because only part you deliver everything when you apply, but only part B1 is evaluated at the first round, and part B2 could have been polished, but at the same time, apparently it was good enough, and the application was successful in the end. But it's a big effort. And I also have to say it was hard for me to understand exactly what they wanted. So local universities and institutions run courses to prepare for the ERC application. And basically what you learn, or what I learned in those courses, is to really understand what they want. So the spirit of the call, which is the most important thing, because otherwise, if you don't have clear the spirit of the call, you work a lot, but not with a bit of track.
Yeah, I agree. That's something we often hear in the ERC field, that we don't have to understand what makes ERC unique in order to write a successful application. And apparently you went to a very good course, so you did well. But we often hear that people get the ERC grants in the second round, that they try to apply and so on. So it is a very competitive grant to achieve. So yeah, it's a very well done to get it in the first time you apply.
So one question here for you, Enrico, in the Q&A from someone who already has an MSCA individual fellowship or had one and is thinking of applying for another postdoctoral fellowship. Is there any special issues I should consider? I see that you, Enrico, already applied for and got 2 MSCA grant. Any advice on that from you?
I would say the advice is it should be meaningful for them to support you. What I mean is you cannot jump from a Marie Curie to another Marie Curie just to move around or because you need the next contract, which is a strong need when there's no permanent position. So you should show that in a way is meaningful and it fits with the spirit of the call. For me, I had my first Marie Curie in the UK, and then there was a postdoc. Well, in a way, I showed that someone was happy to pay me to stay there for 3 more years, and then I simply moved on, because the first destination doesn't necessarily have to be the last one, and I used Marie Curie as a way to support that, and the two projects were quite distinct, different, and in both cases I strongly motivated why the UK first, the University of York first, and the University of Copenhagen then were the right places for me, and why I was a good match for them. In the end, the mobility aspect is focused on deploying the policy of the creation of the common research, the European research area. So people that doesn't stop at national level, but they receive an education at some point, and then they move in Europe, and that considered it's part of the policy that the European Union wants to create. And accordingly, I'm not surprised that people with a Marie Curie has more chances to get an ERC, because they fulfill this policy.
Thank you, Enrico. And I think also just to add to the point of applying again for a postdoctoral fellowship, of course, important to very clearly illustrate how this helps your career grow and why this is sort of strongly done through a fellowship from where you started with your previous individual fellowship until now. So I think no more questions coming in, and we're a little bit over time, so we'll finish here. There are a couple of questions that we did not have time to answer in the Q&A. I think a lot of them we also answered in writing, but please do send us your questions via email. We will send out the presentation, as I said, and both of our emails are included there, and also, of course, through the email. So get back to us, and we're happy to answer your questions at any time. Thank you, Enrico, again for attending and for joining us. And thank you, everyone. Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Bye. Have a good day.
Goodbye.
Bye.